being able to say, okay, you can come in crises, but the work and the energy that you need to put as a patient to solve the issue is going to be consistency and follow through and making sure that you come for that maintenance part, right? Or even just for as long as it takes for the actual acute situation to go away. But then after that, that's where the work really starts. Is like, okay, why did this happen? Let's do that. And the more frequent you come, the less you'll have to come later, because, we're going to deal with.
I'm Dr. Emerald.
And I'm Kat Garcia.
And we're Painting Wellness, where we talk about the pieces of health,
relationships, and wellness
that create the art of life. Welcome, everyone.
Hey.
I'm Dr. Emerald.
You forgot your name?
I'm being cued by our producer Jada to do and not do things. I think I was probably out of focus, is what I'm guessing.
Okay.
So, and well, who are you?
I'm Kat Garcia. Awesome.
Well, this is episode 2. We're back in it, and today. So what I was trying to do there is I'm working on segues, and that whole thing of piecing things together is what we're more or less going to be talking about today.
Yeah.
Is how our health is like a puzzle, and so how do we piece different things together in order to see ourselves and help ourselves as a whole, instead of just getting really compartmentalized into smaller areas.
Yeah.
So
do you
Kat,
think?
can you help me out here?
Yeah. So a lot of the conversation we were having was last week. We talked about advocacy, and so we were talking this week about, okay, within the advocacy part, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's the provider or the patient, who is responsible for putting those pieces together?
Yeah. And
like, who does most of the work or some of the work? Do they both do the work? Because we want to make sure that we're healing our bodies when we're looking for help medically or mentally or whatever, that we're healing our body as a whole. So we don't want to leave pieces hanging. So you can't complete the puzzle that way. Mm-hmm. So whose responsibility does it fall on?
I would say both, but at the end of the day, I like to think, for myself at least, that a lot of that does come down to the individual themselves. Because if I'm the patient, if I don't care about completing that puzzle, I don't think it's fair for me to expect that the provider cares more than I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the provider wouldn't know, right?
Yeah.
Although that's the goal, is that the provider is going to ask some probing questions.
They're going to help.
They're going to help.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think, the onus of advocacy always falls on the patient, because if you don't tell us it hurts or it's bothering you, there's no way for us to know. Mm-hmm. So if the provider doesn't ask, the patient should definitely say something.
Yeah. Well, coming in and having things and being willing to have that conversation. But I think that's a big skill for the provider, is having questions that you're comfortable asking to start those conversations, and being able to go through and ask follow-up questions, or if you hear different maybe keywords or things. There's a word that I'm totally afraid of, where like you're asking questions that prompt deeper conversations. Mm-hmm. And I don't.
It's like open-ended questions.
Open-ended questions, yeah. That was something that took me a while to learn how to ask those type of questions as a provider, certainly. Being comfortable in that.
Yeah. And I think that, it also depends on the type of provider. When I mean the type, I mean the type of medicine they practice, right? In my practice, we can ask, because we're mental health therapists, so we can ask a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And it's easy for us we have a different kind of rapport. People are coming in and telling us like really deep stuff. And so us asking for more information is typically expected, right? And so when we refer people out to other things, it's taken like, well, you know me, you know all these things. But I know that with other medical providers, maybe like yourself, I wonder, how is it as a provider that you bridge the gap, or you find a way to help patients find those puzzle pieces, especially if they're not asking, but you notice?
Yeah. I mean, that can be tricky in the sense, that, again, it's that push-pull of, if I only see myself as very like isolated and I'm on an island, I've got my musculoskeletal stuff that I'm working on, I'm not likely to ask those questions. And similarly, if the patient only is coming in and they're seeing it as, I'm only here to correct my back problem, that can be some barriers that is going to make it harder to have those conversations, as well as figuring out what other things could be helpful. When I really started seeing things as complementary, and what the work that I was doing with someone was more of a collage or blend with mental health, with nutrition, exercise, that changed a lot of things. Because now all of a sudden, if I'm pulling on one string, I could see how that was affecting other things further down the line.
Absolutely.
And it made it a lot more fun too for me as a provider, where I didn't feel like so much in the grind. It was unique. Each puzzle was unique. And
it's that idea of being present as a provider, right? Having that mindfulness and being really listening, not just taking one symptom and running with that, but what does it look like? Multiple symptoms. When we ask questions, we can see the list of symptoms and what the big picture is. And I think, one of the things that I think that perhaps is really important as providers is when we see patterns. So if the person keeps coming back for the same thing and we're providing services for that complaint, but it's not getting better, or it's not improving at all, or going away, so as a provider, I think at that moment the onus is on us. Instead of the patient saying, well, what you're doing is not working, is, why is this patient coming back with the same concern? And then asking questions, being present and paying attention. And I think that as providers, we really have to be mindful about being really present and not, we all have times where we're distracted and things like that. But if we are not present in sessions, how do we ask those questions?
Yeah, and hear it. And I think that plays a huge piece of being able to, I guess, have a clear mental state to be able to be present in that and not be thinking about the other admin stuff. Because I think that's where we could miss a lot of those similarities, or the consistencies that someone is continuing to come in with, is if we're just going through the routine without actually diving into it, it's easy to miss that. I always like to think, I play a game with myself, so to speak, is I really like Sherlock Holmes. And that's where it's like trying to put all of those pieces together. And I tell people that now. It's like, hey, I might be asking you, and that's where the bridge probably does help in connecting those dots, is I tell people, I may ask you questions that seem totally unrelated. But I like to think of myself as a detective. And so when I ask these questions, it's because I'm wanting to get that fuller picture.
Yeah, I love that.
And it like makes it fun for everyone. And then I can ask those maybe seemingly unrelated questions, and people are more willing to go with it because they're like, oh right, they're like a detective, and they're just needing the pieces of the puzzle to be able to put it together.
Absolutely.
And that's actually that's made it a lot easier to have those conversations. Actually, is to make it a game. I like gamifying things.
Yeah. Well, I remember, you were adjusting somebody that we both know, and you were asking, well, do you have digestive problems? And they were coming here for their hip, and it's like, okay, how is that even a thing? And so, you went and you explained, oh, well, if they do this and it links and all the things. And so, I mean, if you hadn't asked that question, you might have missed, the severity of it, or it's something else that was going on, and how we can help the person change what they're eating, or how they're doing, or what they're stretching, or whatever the thing is. So I think I think it falls on both of us, as a patient and as a provider, and to ask those questions. And I think the mindfulness piece is really, really important for us as providers, because we cannot see the big picture if we're just focusing on just little things and separating them.
Yeah, I think but it's so easy to do that.
Absolutely.
And being aware that we need to take that step back is a big piece. Now, it almost seems like the provider's role is to set the path, put the stones out for the person to walk along, but then as the patient or the individual, you really then have to be willing to go on that journey, right? And maybe that can be a bit of a roadblock in and of itself, where it's like, well, I'm here, I showed up, and I'm going to sit down and you do the things.
The things, yes. Yeah, and I think that we have to be comfortable with the idea that, making the appointment, showing up is not going to necessarily solve all the issues. I know in therapy, we always talk about acute versus chronic, and people come in crises, and I always ask, why now? Why in therapy now? Well, there's always a crisis at that moment, right?
Yeah.
And so, and the reality is that even if you come here in a crisis to therapy, we probably can't fix whatever's happening because in one visit. And so being able to say, okay, you can come in crises, but the work and the energy that you need to put as a patient to solve the issue is going to be consistency and follow through and making sure that you come for that maintenance part, right? Or even just for as long as it takes for the actual acute situation to go away. But then after that, that's where the work really starts. Is like, okay, why did this happen? Let's do that. And the more frequent you come, the less you'll have to come later, because, we're going to deal with all that. And I think that it's the same for medical doctors and taking care of the crises, but how do we prevent those crises from happening, right?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we've had this conversation at least a half a dozen, if not more times of I like to use the example of, let's say you have water damage on the wall, or like a leak in your roof, crises, right? That is creating major issues. You can see that things are happening. Your wall is practically, you've got a nice waterfall feature all of a sudden. Some people are into it.
It's a vibe.
But yeah, I needed to be more relaxed in my home, so I just let it flow. Just let it go.
Don't fix it.
Yeah. So a lot of people, it seems like the mindset though is like, oh, I just need to patch that wall. As soon as I patch the hole, the water is stopped. I don't have to worry about anything else. They take care of that acute or that crisis stage. I tend to then ask, well, what about the other things that happened behind the wall that now we don't see, and then it's easy to forget because there's no water coming down? And a lot of times it could be months, it could be years, but there's probably rot and there's probably mold behind that wall until some other event crisis happens, and then all of a sudden we're really in this foundation that's not stable, and then things really start to fall apart. I think that's when I'm looking at that, I'm like, let's just start really taking care of the deeper issues as well. Let's patch it up, but then start making sure that we're framing things out, so then when that next event happens, we're more stable and able to also deal with that stuff.
I think as providers, I think it may be easier for us to say, hey, as a client, as a patient, the thing for you is to come during the crisis. That's great. We're here for you. Stay for the consistency, the repair of all these other things. But I think sometimes the issue may be where either the provider or the patient is unable to express that that's what's needed, or like, I'm a patient, I want to come for acuteness. You're not telling me necessarily that I should come more often for one reason or another. I'm not piecing it together, and you're not telling me either. And so I wonder sometimes, what are the barriers, right, for providers to actually have those conversations, because those can be hard conversations to have.
Yeah, because they can be uncomfortable, or we may not know how to have them. There was a study that MSU did, actually, I think it was in July of 2022, so recent as of the recording of this podcast, where it was less than like half of the providers were even having those conversations, but the overwhelming majority of the patients wanted those conversations with their providers. So that either lets us know that, there's a disconnect somewhere with the providers not wanting to have those conversations, and it could be they don't know how, they're not comfortable, whatever it might be. Speaking for myself, the times where I feel the most resistance is when I don't want to feel like I'm being too overbearing.
Has that happened?
Yeah, I mean, it happens. I would say it happens more. It happened more when I was earlier in practice because I wasn't maybe as sure of myself as a provider.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be where I would recommend something, and then there would be pushback, or what I would perceive as pushback. It was probably just I wasn't explaining the benefits, or there was a gap,
Yeah.
regardless. And I wasn't sure how much more I should spend on it, or if I should just keep going, because I didn't want my patient to feel like
Yeah.
I was like cramming things at them that they weren't interested in doing. And so that's where I would say in the past that I felt less than comfortable in those situations. And I would say like that's totally on myself, not like that's not
Yeah.
the patient's responsibility to deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
It's then, I mean, honestly, then I was like, oh, I need to like do more continuing education or go to seminars on how to have those conversations. Because if that's where I'm getting held up in making sure that my practice members are having the best experience, then that's where I need to focus on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, we have to make sure that as providers we're committing the energy that our patients need to doing the things that allow us to know more about what happens with their body, with their health. And patients need to commit to having the energy to also know that, hey, I might need to refer you somewhere else. I might need to do further evaluations. Maybe you come once and I can't figure it out. I need you to come again, and knowing that it's not that the provider is not listening the first time or that the provider is not spending the time, but sometimes it just takes a little longer. And then I might, after my evaluation, I may not be able to treat you, but being open to the referral. What do you think is maybe kind of a solid question that a patient can ask a provider to help with that? Like if they're unsure if the provider is advocating for their health.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would really, really love to hear patients asking more around like, what else could I be doing, or is there something like another provider, another thing that they could be trying to help with what they're going through? Because one, that's prompting me to be thinking more outside the box, but it also, I mean, is showing me that they're really invested in their health. And I think that can up level my energy towards something. Not to say that like you're just going to have providers that are going to sit back, but if I really know that I have a patient that's solidly invested in their health, I'm really going to be spending a lot more energy on that client or that patient.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So we've gathered a lot of information today
Yeah.
About how to piece the puzzle together for both providers and for our patients. I'm going to let you do the hunting part and just give us the just kind of bullet points of the conversation.
Yeah. So what the big pieces that we can just go through and tack down are like what are the next pieces of the puzzle that we're looking at for our health? If we can start gathering those pieces and bringing them together, we get a fuller picture of what's going on for ourselves. And as a provider, being able to ask those questions, being able to be comfortable having those discussions with patients is going to be really key. So if you're finding that there's some discomfort around having those questions, spend some time either learning different techniques, new techniques, talk with other providers that you see as mentors or friends, and workshop that. As patients, be willing to have those conversations, and recognizing that just going in once is likely not going to be the bow on the present. It's going to take a little bit of time to fully understand where things are going and what needs to be focused on. And then being able to ask your provider too, hey, is there anything else that I could be doing or other people that I could be seeing in order to help with the progression of what I'm experiencing?
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for joining Painty Wellness, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.